Welcome to the first edition of Media Monitor in 2018, right here on SABC News Channel 404. And we hope you've had a great festive season. I'm Sakina Kamwendo. Good morning, and thank you for tuning in. And here's a look at what will be discussed on today's show. We'll start with the controversy surrounding free higher education, this as tertiary institutions gear up for new enrollments. And then we'll also take a look at the new law that was introduced in Germany that seeks to impose tighter control on online content in order to restrict hate speech. And right here on the continent, President Joseph Kabila of the DRC, his government pushing for the cutting of the internet and SMS services countrywide in a bid to neutralize his opponents. And lastly, hate him, love him, US President Donald Trump, he commands a huge online following despite his unconventional way of letting off steam. But before we unpack all of these stories, let's first take a look at the news headlines with Shante Yankees. And Shante, great to see you again. Of course, someone had to keep the home fires burning here.
Definitely, Sakina. It's good to have you back in studio. We're discussing the tripartite alliance call from the SACP, as well as having a look at the headlines following that PRASA horrible train crash. Let's get into that. Indeed. The SACP says if the ANC's new NEC ignores calls to reconfigure the tripartite alliance and deal with state capture, it risks losing the 2019 elections. The party commemorated 23 years since the passing of its former leader, Joe Slovo, in Johannesburg, with a call for President Jacob Zuma to stop appealing court rulings and stay away from appointing a commission to investigate state capture. Passenger rail agency PRASA says only one line will be open this morning between Port Elizabeth and Johannesburg. This follows the collision on Thursday between a long-distance Shosholoza mail train and a truck at a level crossing between Kroonstad and Henenman in the Free State. At least 19 passengers were killed, more than 180 injured in the crash. Technicians are still on the scene fixing damaged overhead electric wires and the railway line. And your sporting highlights, Orlando Pirates got their new year off to a great start as they defeated Baraka FC 3-1 in an ABSA Premiership clash at Orlando Stadium. For the win sees Buccaneers move into 5th place on 23 points from 16 matches, while pushing Bakaga down to 6th on 22 from 16. Indeed, stay tuned for more on Media Monitor with Sakina after the break.
And of course, you would think that news takes a holiday as well, but no such luck. And of course, we'll be delving head in to some of those stories right after this. Well, this is Media Monitor. Welcome back. And as you heard, so many stories that we have to really unpack this morning. And we'll do our best to get through as many as possible. But to give us more insight on this morning's discussions, we're pleased to be joined by Chief Executive Officer of Universities South Africa, Professor Ahmed Bawa. We also have media analyst Teboho Ditseho, as well as SABC digital news producer Bukule Putini. Good morning and welcome to the show, everybody.
Good morning.
Morning, Sakina. So firstly, before we even get to digital and unpacking that, let's take a look at what the newspapers are leading with this morning. And starting with the Sunday Times, and this morning they're running with a story about education authorities who are to meet with universities as well as the EFF Student Command tomorrow in an effort to put the brakes on possible clashes this week when masses of aspiring students are set to descend on campuses across the country. And then City Press, they leading with the ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa. His backers are planning for him to take over the reins in the next few weeks, and they want him to deliver the State of the Nation address in February. The Sunday Independent today running with the story about Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa's election as the new leader of the ANC, and that the party's entire top six could be set aside and the election rerun if an ANC KwaZulu-Natal leader gets his way. Now, the Sunday Independent further reveals that Ramaphosa and the newly elected top six, as well as the elections agency, which was contracted to facilitate and manage the ANC's voting processes, and one of its directors in her personal capacity, will be served with court papers this week by Vincent Nyeni, Msunduzi Sub-Region Ward 32's branch chairperson of the Moses Mabhida region. Looking at the Sunday Tribune, their lead this morning is a story about land conflicts on farms. Amid the land-related conflicts, Deputy Minister of Labour and Honorary President of the Congress of Traditional Leaders of South Africa, Controlesa Pategila Holomisa, fears that expropriation of land without compensation could be a recipe for war. And then the Weekend Argus, they leading with the story about free education. More questions being asked of the government's ability to fund free tertiary education for 2018, which is estimated to cost at around 12 billion rand. And that's what you can look forward to reading more about in the papers. But now let's shift focus and take a look at what the biggest hashtags were on social media this week with Butule. It's been a busy start to the year.
It has been really, Sakina. At the top of our list, we have the matric results. Now, a lot of South Africans on social media have been congratulating the class of 2017, and it has achieved a 75.1% pass rate. This is a 2.6 increase from the 72.5 achieved by the 2016 class. Now, Minister NG Mutsecha announced that the overall matric pass rate in Auckland Park this past Thursday. Now, despite a decrease with the Free State, it remains the best performing province, followed by Gauteng. Let's take a look at what people are saying on social media. Now, Nomcebo Sibanda says, congratulations to all the matrics of 2017. I'm so proud of you. Hashtag matric results 2017. And Nolwazi says, now that the matric results are improving every year, when are the universities or other tertiary institutions going to be built to accommodate all these brilliant new matriculants? We do not have enough tertiary institutions.
Let's pause there. Professor Bawa, when are some new universities going to be built? We know of the two that have come online,
yes.
But you know, in what state are they at this point, capacity-wise?
Yes, they're still very small, of course. They've just, they're just open doors. But the plan is to grow them over the next 5 years to substantial institutions. So there will certainly be a growth trajectory with those two institutions. But the other institutions are also looking at growth. In fact, the system is growing at about 1.2% per year.
And it absolutely has to. And I think there's always a temptation, Teboho, to somehow, minimize the achievement of matriculants. And we should caution against that. But it's hard to when you think about studies that reveal that you have the majority of grade 4s who still can't read and count.
Absolutely. I think that our matriculants have done well. I think we've got a lot of potential out there that's being cultivated. And I think that if we are able to, try to create a process where we further train them into a field of their competency, we're going to see a lot of growth in the country.
And we absolutely have to. But Kule, what else was trending?
So what else was trending was the train and truck collision. 19 people have been confirmed to be dead and 180 injured in the crash. Now, a train crashed with a truck, a Shosholoza mail truck, and PRASA has announced that they will open one line this morning between Port Elizabeth and Johannesburg. Now, people were sad by this, and Nosipho Shezi says, what a tragedy this is, an unnecessary loss of lives caused by a reckless person. At such a horrific scene, the truck driver deserves life imprisonment and for his license to be taken away. Hashtag train crash. And Skati Kumalo says, Nkosi Sikeleli Africa. Isabella Meyer says, hashtag pray for South Africa, train crash. May God comfort those mourning the loss of their loved ones.
Absolutely, and that was absolutely horrific, that train crash, and a terrible way to start the year, and one feels for those families, and our condolences go out to all.
Now, that was not the only tragedy that happened this past week. The hailstorm in Johannesburg. Mayor Mashaba has declared a local state of disaster after a storm that hit Protea Glen and other parts of Gauteng this past weekend. The cost of the damage caused by the storm is estimated at a cost of 186 million. Over 3,000 houses are said to be affected by the storm. Now, Mashaba says his risk assessment team continues to investigate these damages and they will give out a full report within 60 days. So on social media, people have been saying, Miss Momo says, this crazy Joburg hailstorm as the ancestors showing their displeasure at hashtag Afropunk handling of the whole Solange saga. I see people saw humor in it, but Claire 88ZA says, whoa, so aggressive hailstorm ever. Home, Johannesburg, heavy storm, raining, hail, slow motion. And Claire Taylor says, sure, that was a storm, Johannesburg. Hail was huge, hailstorm, storm, hashtag Johannesburg storm.
You gotta love South Africans, though, Teboho. You know, just looking at that humorous tweet that we saw up first, and we always tend to find the humor in everything. But I tell you what I found quite fascinating, Mayor Herman Mashaba and, you know, his response. But more than his response was the people who have this almost sense of entitlement. And some would say that's been controversial, but why is this firstly the city's problem? Why do people not look to fix these things themselves?
Well, I think it's because they don't have the resources, you know, to fix it themselves. You'll find that, you know, one of our basic constitutional rights, and I think what's important in the Bill of Rights is that we do have a right to decent housing. And I think that perhaps it could be something that the city can look into, you know, to assist, you know, from a humanitarian perspective.
Yeah, it's just interesting that that should be our first port of call. But just very briefly, any other major hashtags?
Yeah, definitely. Lastly, South Africa has been mourning two legends the past week. Firstly, Robbie Malinga, who is a veteran musician and producer. He died at the age of 49 on Christmas Day. And people have been saddened by his death and continue to celebrate his life on social media. Now, at Magwa Boys says RIP Robbie Malinga, and Dwakhta says RIP to the legend Robbie Malinga. And lastly, Snotano says, I'm still disturbed by the Robbie Malinga statue. My people always have to take things to the extreme. Hashtag RIP Robbie Malinga.
Absolutely.
And the second legend that has passed on is Professor William Khotsitsile, popularly known as Brawili. Yeah, he passed on this past week as well, and President Jacob Zuma has declared a special official funeral for the late author and poet. He announced this Saturday night.
And of course, the nation is poorer for it.
Yeah. On social media, at Hilt says, RIP, Kyle says, We are not strangers to the end of peace. We have known women widowed without any corpses of husband, because the road to the mines, like the road to anywhere, is long and littered with casualties, even those who still walk and talk. Now, yeah,
you know, and I guess that will still continue, the outpouring of grief for the poet laureate of this country. But of course, questions surrounding the free higher education will continue as tertiary institutions prepare for free higher education enrollments, and that and more coming up after the break.
After a horrific accident, major questions were asked.
So step one, I asked myself, do I really want to die? And my answer to that was, I'm not sure. And then step two was, do I want my parents to bury me? And the answer to that was no.
Learning kept his brain in full action on how the brain works.
When I was in hospital, right, as I was saying, to catch up with my peers, I started to become obsessed with memory techniques and how the brain works and how we retain information.
Touching lives is his continuous mission.
I now work for a non-profit where we deal with access issues regarding kids with disabilities and persons with disability. We're busy working on beach access.
Being wheelchair-bound did not stop fun in his life.
I party in a wheelchair, I laugh in a wheelchair, I smile in a wheelchair.
For all your uplifting stories, catch Bupilong every Friday.
Welcome back to Media Monitor. Now, the 2018 academic year started on a high with improved matric pass rate for the class of 2017, and congratulations to all of them. But are there plans in place at tertiary institutions to accommodate school leavers, including those who did not apply? University South Africa has warned that potential students should not come in as walk-in students at universities, whereas the economic freedom fighters, on the other hand, they've called on academically deserving students to report to learning institutions of their choice on registration day to be freely accepted. Now, Minister of Higher Education, Professor Hlengiwe Mkhize, described Malema's call as unrealistic. Meanwhile, another bone of contention is the issue of free education. President Jacob Zuma announced late last year that government will provide free higher education for students who come from poor and working class households. President Zuma is under fire for pronouncing free higher education, with opposition parties calling for him to clarify what that free education plan actually looks like. Let's take a look at this insert.
Higher Education and Training Minister Professor Hlengiwe Mkhize outlining the country's free education plan. Less than a month after President Zuma's announcement, the ball is now rolling. The president announced this despite the Higher Commission findings that free higher education is not feasible. But the minister is confident of an achievable free tertiary education budget.
It will somehow assure South Africans that we are reasonably implementing this without disrespecting the approved fiscus of the country. Remember, this budgeting process started with the hashtag fees must fall. It's not, as I've said already, there were funds which were identified, which were put within NSFAS exactly for this. So I might not give you the exact amount. Again, colleagues, I don't want to be in conflict with the Minister of Finance. He made a plea to the President not to delve into that space.
Strict conditions will apply for funding, meaning not all students will automatically qualify, and walk-ins will certainly not be entertained.
Government will like to assure young people and all South Africans that all those in possession of a firm offer from a university or TVET college, but who did not apply for NSFAS funding will be identified. Students who may not have applied at any of our institutions or NSFAS and are looking for space in the post-school system will be assisted through the Central Applications Clearinghouse.
Students from households with an income of up to 350,000 rand will be considered.
We haven't opened the application process, and as the Minister has said, the process is as follows. We will make sure that the 300,000 applications are assessed in line with the new criteria. We are no longer going to make wholesale awarding of funding to anyone. We will only base that on, do you have an offer from a higher learning institution?
There are fears of chaotic scenes when universities open, but the intelligence says a holistic plan is in place to counter this.
We are going to work with student formations that are there on campuses, including those we have commented. We will also work with them because ours is to make sure that the state is protected. Ours is to make sure that government respond to the people of South Africa, and ours to make sure that we implement the policies of the ruling party.
Most universities will start with first-year student admissions from Monday. EFF has again called on potential students to walk in at universities to apply for places. But Professor Mkhize has warned that the free tertiary education policy should not be used to encourage disruptions and mayhem at the country's universities. Now, most universities have already finalized applications for the 2018 academic year, and this means that they might not be taking any further applications for the first semester intake. Patricia Fasachi, SABC News in Pretoria.
And of course, the time is nice, so the fun and games are set to begin this week. And there's a lot to discuss about this. A lot's been said about the announcement of free education made by President Jacob Zuma. And this was just as on the morning, in fact, when the party's elective conference last year kicked off. But will there be free education or not? Professor Ahmed Bawa, firstly, let's start here. The Minister of Hlengiwe Mkhize, Minister of Higher Education, she says that there was extensive consultation. So the universities, you seem to say that no, you were left in the dark with regard to some of these discussions. So what is actually the story here?
Yeah, you know, we don't want to have a fight with the minister. In fact, we want to work together. But I think we have to make it clear that the first we heard of the new plan was on the 16th of December. There had been no consultation, no discussion about it prior to that. Now, and you know, we've agreed with the minister that we are going to disagree about this. But you know, and now our big challenge is to understand how to work very closely with the department and the minister and with NSFAS to understand how to get this system to work for our students.
Which is very worrying, because if you were not consulted, it means, therefore, that you could not plan adequately for the eventuality of these provisions that were announced. So what are you going to do?
Yes, so, you know, we've made that point that we would have, ideally, we would have liked to have had a year to roll out this big new program. Instead, we've got 2 or 3 weeks. So it's a recipe for danger, if you like, for risks, you know. Having said that, I want to just say that, you know, in meetings with the department and with NSFAS, we think we've got a system in place now that will work. And as long as we don't have tremendous kind of upheavals and so on during this period, the system should work. And, you know, if you like, later on, I'll be able to give some detail about that.
Absolutely. But you also go on to say that this is essentially an extension of NSFAS, as opposed to it being free higher education.
That's correct. Look, I don't want to underplay its importance, because it does have a huge impact, not just on higher education, but on families in the poor, what President Zuma called poor and working class families. If 90% of the households don't have to worry about the accessing money for the students to go to university, that's a huge advance, and we must accept that. And now the big challenge is to understand how to make it work.
And it's not just about the poor, though, Tebogo Ditseho, because you have middle-class families who are also under extreme pressure, but who constantly seem to find themselves outside the fold of any scope of solutions that are put forward.
And that's in the definition of poor. So the current definition, I think it's around 350,000 rands per year, and that's collective income. And so I think that's very good, because you need to understand the cost of living goes up. When you're previously disadvantaged, you can't just look at the amount of money that you have. You have to also look at disposable income. Some people have historic debt that they have to deal with. Some have a lot of dependents. And so NEFSAS is a system that is able to look at how many dependents do you have? What is your background? Do you live with both of your parents? Are they both responsible for you? And whether or not they can afford to pay for you. And so that is going to now impact on more students and more middle-class families. In terms of the announcement itself, I'm actually in two minds. I'm relieved and I'm concerned. I'm relieved because they didn't take the HERO Commission's recommendation to sell our tertiary institution system to the banks and to financial institutions, where they were going to provide all students, that is about 2 million students, with a government-guaranteed loan. And once you have you receive the loan, SARS is going to chase you, for your money. And if you want to now go to another country and live in another country, you're not going to be able to leave until you have paid the loan. And I think that is another form of financial bondage in which Britain and the United States students find themselves in. So I'm very relieved that the president didn't take that route, but I'm concerned. And the concern that I have is that, there's poor students who are living in townships and rural communities do not have a voice in the media. They also don't have that lobbying power that the students in tertiary institutions have, of closing down institutions until their demands are met. Students in disadvantaged communities do not have access to quality education. They don't have access to recreational facilities. And they have as much potential as the students who are accessing quality education. So why is it that we are not funding, the improvement of the infrastructure of these township and rural schools? Why is it that we're not upskilling more teachers to provide that quality education in those schools? Because if the foundation is not right, the whole house is going to collapse.
But doesn't it speak to the depth of the problems that we are faced with and the complexity that we are dealing with? Because there's so much that needs to be set right, and everybody wants their piece of that pie to be in order. But as it were, you have the EFF who say that, given the president's announcement, students who qualify, who are deserving, should report at institutions starting tomorrow. And I saw you as University of South Africa, Professor Bauer, saying shouldn't happen.
Yeah. Look, again, I think that, what politicians and political organizations have to refrain from is making this a political football, And I think that that's a very serious challenge for us. It began on December 16th, I'm afraid. But let's just go on. For any student who's applied for entry to a university in 2017 for 2018, there's no problem. Whether they've applied for financial aid or not, those students will be processed and there'll be no problem. It's just students who have not applied to universities where the big challenge raises. And the EFF is absolutely right to pick up the issue, because it's the critical component, if you like. So the question is, what's the solution, right?
What is the solution?
What is the solution?
Are your institutions prepared for those walk-ins?
So none of the universities are going to, push students off campus, But clearly, the idea that students will be able to come to campus and apply for admission now is not feasible, because all the processing has already begun, offers of place have been made already, and so on. So there is a facility which is called the Central Application System at DHET, which was put in place after the tragic events at UJ in 2012. And basically what that does is that it allows students to submit their details, and then for the DHET with the universities to place students, because each university on a daily basis provides DHET with an indication of where the places are, what programs still have places, which programs are full, and so on.
But with regard to funding, where's the money going to come from?
If a student is admitted to university and is in the 120, is in the 0 to 350 family income category, there's no question. That's our understanding. There's no question financial aid will be, the bursary will be made available.
And of course, this is not the end. It's only the beginning as we step into 2018 with the story with the universities and fee-free higher education. But Professor Ahmed Bawa of University South Africa, thank you so much for coming through. And of course, we'll talk about this more in the future, I have no doubt.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me.
So when Media Monitor returns, we'll take a look at the newly introduced hate speech law in Germany.
Countries in the East African region have started experimenting with wines.
Located in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo in South Kivu province, this park is the only place in the world to find the eastern lowland gorillas.
But the most famous monument in Casablanca is of course the Mosque Hassan II. The mosque is the third largest in the Muslim world.
The city of Tel Aviv and Israel's tourism ministry have teamed up with the local hotel chain to temporarily transform the tower into a two-story suite with hot tub, room service, and very unobstructed ocean views.
Catch Trends Travel every Sunday from 12 to 1 for all the global travel and leisure trends.
I hope you're having a lovely Sunday morning. This is Media Monitor and welcome back. Germany, they've introduced a new law and this is meant to restrict hate speech on social media. The law, which came into effect on January the 1st, can impose fines of up to $60 million on sites that fail to remove hate speech postings within 24 hours of receiving such a notification. And social networks and media sites with more than 2 million members will fall under the law's provisions. And meanwhile, here on the African continent, the Democratic Republic of Congo's government last Saturday ordered telecommunications providers to cut internet and SMS services across the country ahead of planned anti-government demonstrations. And grassroots Catholic activists had organized marches in major cities to demand that President Joseph Kabila not change the constitution, a move that would enable him to stand for a third term. And for more on this, we joined by the SABC's US correspondent, Bryce-Pease. How lovely to have you with us here.
How lovely to be here. Thank you, Sakina.
So hopefully we can get you a tan before you go back.
I intend to make everyone jealous when I get home. It's blizzard conditions, minus 13.
I saw that.
And it's wonderful to be here. I think my timing is quite impeccable.
It certainly is. Well, impeccable for many reasons, not least of which the topics under discussion. And we've seen, especially towards the latter part of 2017 and now the beginning of 2018, quite a flurry in terms of social media and how different countries are trying to regulate and deal with this problematic new form of media and how people communicate. But let's start by looking at Germany and this law that they've now introduced and hoping to deal effectively with hate speech.
I think what you're seeing, Sakina, in terms of policies by companies like Twitter and Facebook in the United States, they have very clear policies, whether you're the President of the United States tweeting derogatory statements or a layperson like yourself and myself, that they have very clear policies that your account will be suspended if you are found to have breached their editorial code. Of course, this is coming to effect, I think, in the aftermath of the US election. You had a lot of alternative facts being spread there. Of course, you have this long-standing Russia investigation into possible collusion with the Trump campaign and meddling in the United States election. And so there's a real awareness, I think, now post that election as to what is viable in terms of these social media networks, given the impacts that these platforms are now having on society. They are shaping how people vote, they're shaping what people think, how they behave. And so social media companies, beyond what governments are doing, companies, private sector companies have taken a view of this, that it needs to be regulated, and so they have very strict and firm editorial policies in that regard.
But it's not an easy task, Tebogo, given that one has to then be very clear on your definition of what constitutes hate speech, for example, in the German situation.
Yeah, so if the definition is wide, then you'll find a lot of people in hot water. So you need to have a very clear-cut and a pointed definition of what is hate speech. I think we are suffering, in South Africa from a problem of hate speech, where people now take up anonymous identities on social media in order for them to spread that kind of propaganda.
Okay, but what is hate speech then? What sort of messages are you talking about?
Well, hate speech, in a nutshell, is where you could be inciting violence, against a general population or against an individual person. It could be also where you discriminate against somebody based on their gender or their race and so on and so forth. And so, that is the kind of speech, that, it can turn dangerous, as Germany knows, back in the times when they were led by Adolf Hitler. And so Germany has been very clear about anti-Semitism, about racism, and there are serious consequences, in Germany if you do spread hate speech. In fact, you can face up to 3 years in prison if you're found guilty for that. And so they take it very seriously. Now, the problem comes when you are abusing it for your own political ends. And hopefully that will not be the case. I think that if you look at Facebook and Twitter, they have not been as successful as we wish they could have been in dealing with hate speech. But I was quite surprised, and rightfully so, when somebody called me the K word on Twitter. And I reported that, and Twitter suspended his account.
Absolutely.
It doesn't work anymore. And the K word is not known in the US, and so I was...
Well, they have an N word in the US. There's something similar. I think also it's going to be interesting to watch the parliamentary process in this country. My understanding is there's a hate speech bill that is within the works, and it's going to be interesting to see how our legislators come up with a definition that is probably going to be challenged in the courts, probably up to the Constitutional Court, in terms of what is free speech and when then do you limit it.
And that is the interesting distinction, because are you then infringing on people's right to freedom of expression?
In the United States, which is the best example, they have the First Amendment, and this is a First Amendment that I think was passed in the late 1700s, and basically it says Congress cannot legislate against the freedom of people to associate with whatever religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech and the press. So a law like this probably wouldn't fly. It wouldn't fly in the United States.
So what would you say are some of the immediate implications of a law like the one that was passed in Germany on everybody else? Even as in South Africa, as Sherwin was saying, our lawmakers grappling with a certain, dispensation now where they have to come up with certain laws to regulate social media. How are laws such as the ones passed in Germany likely to impact on us?
Well, I'm very circumspect when it comes to limiting freedom of speech, because the boundaries are very, it's very difficult to set boundaries on freedom of speech. And you find that the people who are going to set boundaries are going to use it for their own specific agendas. And so I prefer the situation that we see in South Africa, where we don't have those kind of boundaries on freedom of speech, yet you do have recourse in the Equality Court, and there is a law in South Africa where if you do spread hatred and racism, you can be held accountable.
Is this about politicians being a bit petty, perhaps? Are they a bit, soft under the skin and perhaps just not used to having people come up and tell them exactly what they think of them?
I think you don't need to turn on your television to get the news anymore. I think everybody has access. When we report on a story, people are commenting immediately. People will probably be disagreeing with some of the views that they're hearing on this program. That is the egalitarian nature nature of social media. So that is a good thing. It opens up transparency. It gives you closer access to your legislators, to people that are making decisions on your behalf. Your opinions are heard by everybody. I think that's a good thing. It does become complicated, and I'm no expert on this, as to where you then draw the line and who determines where that line should be drawn. That is why we vote, and that is why we elect people to Congress or to Parliament.
And that's the million-dollar question, because if you look at what's happening in the DRC, for example, and when I saw that last Saturday, as much as I tried to stay away from the news and social media, you know, I was taken aback, because here you have a government sending out communication to network service providers saying, we need you to cut SMSs, we need you to cut social media, and wholesale, so that people cannot communicate and mobilize if they so wish.
Now, that is where it's being abused, obviously. In Germany, they're just trying to regulate it, whereby the social media providers need to delete that specific post. In the DRC, they're just saying you can't communicate, you can't express yourself using SMS or social media. My question is, what is the response from some of the neighboring countries of the DRC? Why is it that whenever there is, you know, some freedom of speech is being infringed, that none of the other African countries seem to want to comment?
But let's look at who the neighboring countries are. The neighboring countries are the likes of Burundi. The neighboring countries are South Sudan, for example. These are countries that themselves are battling with discontent on the ground. And so what is the first thing you see, as we've just recently seen with the protests in Iran, for example, is they shut down Instagram, they shut down social media so that people cannot communicate and get together for these protests. I think it absolutely undermines democracy.
It certainly does, but it's a good question that you guys pose about what do other governments, and they don't even have to be neighboring. If you're sitting anywhere in the world in this global village and you see that happening, why aren't you speaking out against it?
The pot, Sakina, doesn't call the kettle black, right?
It certainly doesn't. Well, more Media Monitor when we return. Do stay tuned.
What is environmental health?
In Section 24 of the Constitution, the environmental right has a second part, which is to encourage people to be active citizens and gives us the right to participate in politics and organize and raise awareness so that the environmental right can be guaranteed.
Using coal and wood and paraffin to cook with or to heat their space or to heat water. These are basic fundamentals, and I think if we can address that alone, we will make a huge impact, an environmental impact on the health of our population.
Food that comes into the country, the vigilance at the ports and harbours is being checked at the moment currently by environmental practitioners who are port officers at those ports. They need to be more stringent in terms of control of what comes into the country.
Join Health Talk every Saturday for all your health news.
Africa is constantly getting new technologies, and with that comes new terms.
Massive, open, online university. And primarily what they are doing is they're established in the community, so they're well established within the Soweto community.
Internet of Things also covers small sensors, so you can do like home security, motion detectors, IP cameras.
Our network will simplify these terms for you. We also have new gadgets and social media.
When it falls on the grounds and then the battery, everything falls off, people just put it all together and then your phone is back in shape.
The Valega app, we initially started off by doing this manually.
The internet is actually my favorite fashion invention of all time.
Let's network with Ms. Pumelele Zondi every Sunday at 9 p.m. on SABC News.
Well, as cliched as it is, time certainly does fly when you're having fun. Well, U.S. President Donald J. Trump, he is unlike any president in history. His unconventional way of communication continues to have many talking. Now, he's been quoted saying, "My use of social media is not presidential, it's modern-day presidential, and he boasts an estimated whopping 125 million followers across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Now, Trump has on occasion given credit to social media for him becoming the 45th president of the United States of America, but could this ultimately be the way that future presidents will communicate with their constituencies, with their nations, via social media? Sherwin?
The answer, I think, in short, is yes. It's how you communicate. I think when you talk about the communication strategy of a presidency, whether it be the Kremlin or the White House or the office of the president in South Africa, I think what you seek as journalists, as people that cover that office, is predictability. And unfortunately, with the content that you see on the Twitter feed of President Trump isn't necessarily thought out. It tends to be knee-jerk. It tends to be shooting from the hip. And I think that complicates the massive communication staff that the White House employs. Who can forget the fundamental, the seminal moment that I think shaped the relationship between the press and the White House was the day after the inauguration when Sean Spicer, the former press secretary, was marched out to the press briefing room, basically to argue that that was the largest inauguration crowd in the history of presidential inaugurations. And having attended both President Barack Obama's inauguration and President Trump, it really doesn't take a scientist to look at the comparative pictures to see that Obama killed it in terms of the number of people that were there. So it is, I think, that moment where the alternative fact, this unimportant aspect of who had the biggest crowd size in terms of the agenda that this president is seeking to implement, it was that sort of nonsense that I think has shaped how a tumultuous and certainly an acrimonious relationship between the press and the Twitter feed of Donald Trump.
But of course, whatever Donald Trump tweets is official.
Absolutely.
So, you know, and therein lies another problem, because if, as Sherwin says, sometimes these tweets are not thought through. The videos that he posted about a month or so ago, you know, it was very controversial, but these are official, because this is how he has chosen to communicate as President of the United States. How would you, if you were in his cabinet, how would you deal with this situation?
Well, I think Donald Trump needs to start surrounding himself with people who are not yes men, who can tell him the truth straight to his face.
Which president does that?
I think there's a lot of presidents who do that. And you've seen the previous president, the United States misses him, Barack Obama. They miss him.
Well, is it about the people about him, or is it that he just,
it's not about the individual.
Guy?
I don't think it's about the individual. I think
at leadership level was able to make sound decisions.
There was a moment, Sakina, when one of his first cabinet meetings where he literally allowed them to go. Remember, these billionaires, millionaires, the former CEO, he's Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, the former CEO of ExxonMobil. These are powerful individuals in their own right, literally sitting around a cabinet table and complimenting the President of the United States for things that probably hadn't happened at that point. I'm so grateful that you employed me. You're wonderful. Love working for you. I mean, that is a strange scenario where somehow these important individuals, cabinet secretaries, are having to shower the principal in the room with praise. What an odd! I don't think Obama would ever have done that.
It's odd, but perhaps this is happening more public than we are perhaps used to seeing.
No, Obama was very responsible, and that's why America misses Obama.
If we say Obama is the exception, let's talk about other presidents. You think they're not surrounded by yes men who sing their praises? People who will prop up a president so that he stays in power? How do presidents controversially remain in power if it's not that they are surrounded by yes men?
Fair question.
Well, that's a very fair question. We're not in the room when they're talking, but I do believe...
And they don't tweet as much.
Which is why I say perhaps it is not as public as Donald Trump seems to do it, but it would seem as though there are many who would succumb to that same sort of style.
So well, if I was behind Donald Trump, I would definitely give him solid advice, you know, as to how he should be managing his social media accounts. In as much as you feel, after Kim Jong-un says that he has a nuclear button on his desk, you might feel like saying, well, my button is bigger and it works. But you're not going to say that in public.
Right, right. Well, if you look on the screen right now, there's the visuals of this Fire and Fury book that came out on Friday. And basically, this is an account of an insider's look into the White House. The author apparently spent a year interviewing insiders, and what emerges from this book is that you have a very incompetent president in the White House House, who's not a policy fundi, doesn't really care to read his intelligence reports, tweets at the early hours of the morning. People from inside this White House recognize the dangers that are associated with the president that wants to compare the size of his nuclear button to that of Kim Jong-un's. And so you're seeing these revelations, the sources. You know, the New York Times will reveal all sorts of things based on confidential sources. And I mean, this is old school journalism.
But Donald already responded to that. And this is him on Twitter. Immediate response to that book already.
So you're speaking to this notion of transparency. When does transparency become a good thing and when is transparency a bad thing? And I think as journalists, we should welcome a president that's a little bit more open than the people we don't actually know that perhaps also surround themselves with yes men. So from a transparency point of view, I think this is good. But if you take, for example, the Pakistan tweets, where he was talking about how, accused Pakistan on Twitter of deceit and lies as it relates to fighting terrorism in that porous region along the Afghanistan border. If you look at how he approached that, to call them out publicly on Twitter, I mean, diplomacy, if you speak to anyone in the Department of International Relations in South Africa, they will always say, yes, we do not agree with that, but we'll communicate it through official channels. Twitter is not, it's an informal platform in many ways. This is not a formal platform.
But he has formalized it. For as we've said, whatever Donald Trump tweets is official.
And will be archived.
Absolutely.
For posterity in the National Archives in the United States. So you are right. But there's spelling mistakes on those tweets sometimes. He's tweeting videos of CNN getting punched out in a WWE ring. I mean, you can call that official if you want.
And he's threatening nuclear war.
Well, and many things that he has threatened, like, for example, the Israeli situation with Jerusalem and moving the U.S. embassy. He talks about withholding funding from many countries who are not towing the line, as it were.
The concern there is that when you do that, you then need to know that you have the policy backing behind your tweets. Yeah. There was a tweet about disallowing transgender service people in the United States to serve in the United States Army. Journalists immediately contacted the Pentagon to find out if this was an official policy, and they said referred journalists back to the White House because they hadn't heard of this. The process has been slowly working its way through the courts. The policy hasn't changed. So why did the president tweet that transgender people were not going to be allowed if that is not being implemented?
Because he can, and because he's Donald Trump.
But that creates
the problem. And maybe he's hoping that the policy will follow. I mean, you know, look at the tax cuts right now. And again, you know, he's putting out their numbers. He spoke about the markets, you know, going through the 25K barrier and taking the credit, you know, lapping it up. But then people pointing out that, hold on, it was the Obama presidency that put you on this trajectory to actually get to a point where you could break through that. But, you know, is the media perhaps being a bit harsh on Donald Trump because they don't like him? You know, he talks a lot about fake news
I think there is probably an element of that the media recognizes that, you know, how did this happen? You know, what is this and what does it say about the country, the United States, having just had this historic moment 8 years ago, electing the first black president to the White House, to then also, almost a response to that was the election of someone quite different with a very different worldview. I wanted to call it strange. I'm trying to check myself. And so I think that's problematic in a sense, is that the media has recognized that it's a very tumultuous, acrimonious relationship. So where do they draw the line between subjectivity and objectivity, given the bald-faced lies that sometimes emerge from that White House?
So he's going to announce tomorrow, as we understand, you know, awards for the media. I'm sure Sho and you and many others are looking forward to this because all of us, it would seem, in the main are fake news carriers.
Well, I think these are very interesting times, and I think that we're actually now creating a new precedent, you know, with the presidency of the United States. Because now we've never seen a situation where a president has declared all-out war with the media, especially in the United States. And it's a very interesting topic for communications students to deal with, especially if you look at how mainstream media is losing a lot of circulation in the United States.
Well, love him, hate him, he has made sure that everybody takes note of him, and that's Donald Trump. And of course, we will be keeping an eye out for that announcement tomorrow. Show and Bryce-Pease and Teboho Titeko, thanks so much for coming through this morning. And thank you for watching our show, Media Monitor. We hope that you will join us again, same time, same place next week. For me and the rest of the team, enjoy the rest of your Sunday and stay blessed.